Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on the methodology of happiness and well-being studies. This is the third in a sequence of supplementary lecture material that I'm offering for my University of Toronto course on the philosophy of social science. So if you're interested in the other topics, you can go check out my YouTube channel and look under the playlist for HPS 300 Philosophy of Social Science. So you all have some idea of what happiness and well-being is. You probably think to yourself, okay, there's days that you're happy, days that you're sad, days that you're depressed, days that you're excited, other days that you're really satisfied with your life, and other days that you're completely dissatisfied with your life. So you might think, well, humans are really complex. We have so many different kinds of aesthetic, spiritual, and moral experiences. How is it possible that we could have a natural or social science of happiness and well-being? Well, as you're going to see in today's discussion, there's going to be a lot of disagreement about whether or not this is possible, to what extent it's possible, and we're going to see the different kinds of philosophical controversies that are involved in the methodologies of the natural and social sciences on the topic of happiness and well-being. So we're going to start today's discussion by giving an overview of individual happiness studies, so that is happiness studies focusing on individual subjects. And then we're going to talk about studies looking at measuring the well-being of society overall. So that's going to be understood to be distinct from that of the individual level. We're then going to talk about different philosophies of well-being, so what well-being is, how it ought to be understood. And then we're going to talk about the work of two prominent philosophers of social science who've done a lot of writing on well-being and happiness, namely Anna Alexandrova, who's a professor at Cambridge's History and Philosophy of Science department, and Professor Erik Angner, who's a professor at the University of Stockholm. So Alexandrova's paper is going to be talking about construct validity, that is, what is the justification for measurement and constructs of measurements in happiness studies. And then we're going to talk about Professor Angner's work looking at very skeptical arguments that have been raised in the history of economics, sociology, and psychology on whether or not it's even possible to measure happiness. So as it turns out, in the past few decades, happiness studies and social well-being studies have become pretty mainstream in economic sociology and especially psychology. So from 1996 to 2001 alone, there were 28,612 papers that used the terms well-being and happiness across a wide variety of natural and social scientific disciplines. In 2011, the UN General Assembly meeting on July 19th made the following comment in a resolution. We invite member states to pursue the elaboration of additional measures that better capture the importance of the pursuit of happiness and well-being in development with a view to guiding their public policies. So as you can see, the United Nations itself and its member states have made it a mandate, or at least a desideratum, of their public policies that they orient those policies to pursue specifically the increase in social well-being and individual happiness. Now you might think, well, doesn't every government want its people to be happy? Well, in a sense, yes, but in another sense, not necessarily, because they might privilege other aspects of what makes society well off, such as perhaps they want to increase GDP per capita, maybe they want to stimulate foreign investment, maybe they want to reduce wealth inequality, reduce the incidence of death, increased life expectancy, things like this. So happiness itself being an object or purpose or goal of government policies, while it's been around for obviously a very long time, it took the UN till 2011 to make a kind of explicit call that we need to advocate the promotion of human flourishing and happiness, rather than just avoiding disease, reducing mortality rates, increasing employment, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about what distinguishes the individual well-being studies from that of social well-being studies. And we're going to show that it's distinct from, for example, looking at depression studies and also things like pain studies used in medicine. So there are many different kinds and forms of happiness. So to produce a rough taxonomy for you guys, we're going to start with the idea of hedonic affect. So hedonic affect would be an answer to the question, how much pleasure sensations are you experiencing at a particular time and or place? So for example, when you have a taste of ice cream, that's very pleasurable. When you're hugging someone that you love, it feels very nice. When you listen to pleasurable music, that induces the sensation of happiness in that sense. So that's going to be a kind of sensory kind of happiness and well-being, as opposed to some kind of more sophisticated mental state, such as finding out that you got a raise from your job, or maybe that a loved one is coming home. These sensations of happiness and well-being are no doubt important, but they're a different kind of happiness and well-being from that of hedonic affect. So again, hedonic affect is going to concern sensory pleasure, such as the taste of ice cream, the taste of yummy food, this sort of thing. Subjective well-being is going to be an answer to the question, overall, how is your life going for you? Okay, so that can involve hedonic affect, but it can also involve the mental state satisfaction of finding out that you did really well on a test that you just did, or that you got a promotion, or you heard some really good news and piece of information. So again, that's not immediately sensory affect related. Rather, it's a bit more sophisticated and cognitive insofar as it involves information. There's also aspects of happiness and well-being that clearly involve physiology, like how healthy are you? So people who are typically unhealthy are not as happy or satisfied with their lives. There's going to be different ways to measure this. So one way that some people like to do in neuroscience is to look at dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin levels, this sort of thing. So this is a kind of neuroscientific approach. Now, not all neuroscientists think that these chemicals are either necessary or sufficient for having happiness or well-being, but that they play a causal factor in what it is that your brain does to generate the sensation of hedonic affect especially, and also well-being. There's also a distinct kind of well-being that concerns political well-being. So do you have sufficient rights? So that's going to be important in the discussion of social well-being measures. So, for example, in the Xinjiang region of China, the Uyghur population's ethnic Uyghurs are oppressed. They do not have sufficient political rights. There's many different regions of the world that have minority groups who are oppressed. And so in that sense, their political well-being is not as good as is other people in more developed or free countries. And lastly, there's going to be socioeconomic well-being. Are you socioeconomically secure? So do you have the sufficient income? Do you have the sufficient job and wages? Are you debt-free? These are the kinds of questions that concern your socioeconomic welfare. Do you have sufficient wealth to sustain yourself and your livelihood overall? So again, there's many different forms of well-being, but you can roughly categorize them into these different categories of hedonic affect, subjective well-being, physiological measures, political welfare, and socioeconomic factors that affect your overall happiness. So having talked a bit about the different ways in which you can be well off, we also have to talk about the philosophical conceptions behind the justification for being well off in certain ways as opposed to others. So, for example, the view known as subjectivism is the view that it's entirely up to you to decide what makes you happy, what makes you have well-being. Notice that this is very chaotic and anarchic insofar as what makes some people really happy is for them to just play video games all day, maybe eat a lot of junk food, maybe to consume various recreational drugs. For other people, they think, oh, that's not a kind of life that I think is conducive to happiness or well-being. Perhaps they think actually in moderation those things are fine, or some people think more extremely, if they're conservative, that none of those kinds of things are okay. And others might say actually it's better for you to live an ascetic life, a life that kind of absolves yourself away from any kinds of material goods and pleasures. And so subjectivism is the view that it's actually up to you to decide, that humans are really complex. We have so many different kinds of preferences and different subjective desires that who are we to say what makes a person happy? Shouldn't it be up to them? So that's what the subjectivist view says. That makes it very challenging, not necessarily impossible, but certainly challenging to do a social science that can demarcate the good versus bad lives that happen on this planet. Another view is known as preferentialism, which says that it's actually whether or not your preferences are satisfied. So you might think, well, wait a second, how is that any different than the subjectivism view? Well, the thought here is that people can have preferences, and preferences are the kind of cognitive things, though there's a lot of debates about how to understand preferences, in a way that is not the same as hedonic affect. Okay, so strictly speaking, like your other animals, non-human animals, could have their preferences satisfied. They could also have hedonic affect, but humans have much more sophisticated preferences that need to be satisfied than that of other kinds of creatures such as animals. So, for example, I have a preference as a PhD student that I want to pass my PhD examination. Dogs and cats are not having to deal with preferences of a more sophisticated kind, such as passing tests or, wanting to pay taxes on time or do all sorts of other complex things that humans do. So preferentialism is saying that a person is well off insofar as their higher order cognitive preferences are satisfied. Again, those preferences can be very broad. They can be things like a preference to want to have more leisure time in their life, or a preference for relaxation, or perhaps a preference for a raise for their job, or to get a promotion, these kinds of things. So it's also quite pluralist in that sense. Welfarism is the view that it depends on the sum total of events or causes of your hedonic well-being, okay? So when I talk about the sum total of events or causes, I really do mean the sum total. So sometimes things can be bad, sometimes things can be good, but insofar as it's coherent to measure and cardinally sum the bad and negative experiences, so long as there's kind of a net benefit, then you're better off. So again, this is a philosophy about what well-being is. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about what it is that constitutes well-being. So for welfarists, they think that actually you're well off, that even though you go through a depression, you have some bad times in your life, maybe you're sad a couple days, so long as that the net positives are happening, that is, you have sufficiently higher number of good days or satisfied days to offset those negatives, then you're in a state of overall well-being. That is essentially what welfarism means and what it says. Now, as we're going to see later on, welfarism is really important in the history of development economics and what contemporary economists, specifically in the field known as happiness economics, think about well-being. So when they have these cost-benefit analyses for enacting certain policies or raising taxes or doing welfare programs, they're going to largely, though not always, operate under a kind of welfarist framework. Another view is known as the objective list view. So what does an objective list view says? The objective list view is basically in tension with the subjectivist view. So remember, the subjectivist view says that it's entirely up to you as an individual to decide what makes you well off. Maybe you enjoy reading Leo Tolstoy all day. Maybe you like playing video games. Maybe you like riding your bicycle on the lakeshore. I don't know. The point being, though, is that the objective list view says that nope, there's actually an objective list that demarcates those who are doing well and those who are not doing well. And the contents of that objective list are to be discerned through philosophical, natural, and social scientific analysis. So to give you one idea, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum says that it's a very important and objectively necessary component of a good life that you have an opportunity to have playtime, for example, and that you also have freedom of speech, and that you have a certain base set of political rights, and that you're not malnourished, for example, so that it doesn't matter if various cultures agree or disagree with that. She believes that these are the kinds of objectively necessary things that need to be satisfied for you to have a well-off life. That may sound bigoted or chauvinistic. Totally up to you to decide. Again, the purpose of our discussion today is to help you to come up with your own philosophy of what well-being is and what it is not. Another view that is important in the public discussion about what well-being is things like religious or spiritual well-being, right? So that, again, depends on your metaphysical views. So when I say metaphysics, I don't necessarily mean healing crystals or prayer or all this kind of pseudoscience stuff necessarily. I just mean it depends entirely upon your worldview about how reality is fundamentally structured. So again, a lot of Judeo-Christian Islamic people, they believe that there is a God, that there are these set of holy texts that assign the objective moral and ethical framework to live your life. So if you're a religious person, or if you're a spiritual person coming from a different kind of religion, you might think that actually it is the practice of your religion or cult that is to dictate to you what the good and bad life is. So notice that that's very different than the welfarist view, the preferentialism view, or the subjective view. It is not a matter of subjective preference, it is entirely a matter of what the religious view states is the objective fact of the matter. And in that sense, the religious view is actually a sub-theory of the objective list view, because again, the objective list view could be secularized, it can be based on natural science, it could be based on social science. But the religious view doesn't necessarily need to be based on those things, even though it posits that there are an objective list of things that make your life good and bad. So having discussed various ways in which well-being is constituted and how it should be understood philosophically, we now need to have some initial discussion about the philosophy of measurement and how it is that natural and social scientists come to measure things in general. We need to start with the general discussion before we get to the more particulars of how to measure happiness and well-being, because you're going to see things are quite complicated from a technical perspective. So let me try to walk you through the basics of this, because that's all the time we have. So first, we're going to talk about what are known as nominal measurement scales. So if you're going to do a study, for example, on gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, favorite sports team, race, etc., you're going to be measuring what are known as nominal variables. They're called nominal because nominal means essentially name-like variables. variables. So these are variables that are not quantitative, though you can count the frequency of which individual subjects fall under these categories. You can talk about the number of people who are identify as male in your corporation or company. You can talk about the ethnic orientation of your classmates if you're in a university class. You can count the number of people who identify as homosexual in a given locale, etc., etc. These are nominal measurements because they have to do with different labels. Now, putting that aside, that's the kind of most important base level note of ways of categorizing measurement categories. We then need to get to the beginnings of what are known as quantitative measures. So even though I said that you can talk about the frequency, that is, you can talk about the number, that is not sufficient for you to talk about quantities. In order to talk about quantities, for example, we can't talk about like how masculine or how feminine exactly you are, though there are various attempts to do that. We have to first build up our metrological philosophy from the ground up. So that's why we need to talk about ordinal measures before we get to cardinal measures, and then also ratio measures. So the kind of intuitive idea you have of measurement is probably that of something like a cardinal metric. But again, in order to justify a cardinal metric for a given measurement category, a lot of philosophy and a lot of science has to go into thinking about whether this is justified or not. So the ordinal measure is going to be ones where you can talk about a given phenomena as being ordered with respect to another given class of phenomena. So to give you a really simple example, there's something known as Mohs hardness scale in geology. So if I have a rock and it can scratch another rock successfully, so you have this one rock and it successfully scratches a piece off the other rock, that means this rock is harder than this rock. Okay? Which intuitively makes sense, because after all, if this can scratch this, or if like a knife can cut a piece of bread, that means that the knife is harder than the piece of bread. So you can say that it's harder, but you cannot say by how much it is harder. In order to justify that, you would need to be able to justify what is known as a cardinal metric, which we'll get to in just a moment. So the idea, again, for Mohs hardness scale is you can say A is less hard than B, which is less hard than C, which is less hard than D, but you cannot say by the amount of interval distance that this is harder than this other thing in the set of entities that you're looking at. So diamonds are going to be kind of the hardest geological rock. You can use them to scratch pretty much everything for the most part. Okay, so what's a cardinal metric? A cardinal metric allows you to actually talk about by how much this thing is harder or not than this other thing. So to use an example outside of geology, putting aside the category of hardness, we can talk about temperature. So consider the Fahrenheit and Celsius scale. So if you're an American or you live in Liberia or Myanmar, you probably use the Fahrenheit scale. If you're in the rest of the world, they follow the SI system of units, so we use things like Celsius. So what's going on with Celsius is that when we talk about the temperature increasing, I mean, the same also applies to Fahrenheit, but I'll just use Celsius because I'm familiar as a Canadian with Celsius. You can say that we are increasing the temperature by this many degrees centigrade, okay? So that's saying we can talk about this plus this minus this. So we are 20 degrees hotter than we were yesterday, or we were 5 degrees less hot than we were yesterday, okay? So not only can we say that we are more hot, we can say by how much hotter we are. So that allows, for those who've studied a bit of algebra, for the logical justification for what are known as affine transformations in terms of the mathematics. So an affine transformation is going to be essentially a linear transformation such that you can convert from Fahrenheit into Celsius and you can do various arithmetical operations. We cannot do multiplication and division, though, which I'll talk about in just a second. You can do arithmetical operations on these scales. So even just converting Fahrenheit into Celsius, you start off with a Fahrenheit value such as 212 Fahrenheit. You subtract 32. You divide it by 9, so you get 212 minus 32 is 180, divided by 9 gets you 20, and you multiply by 5 gets you 100 degrees Celsius. So the boiling point of water is 212 Fahrenheit, which is identical to 100 degrees Celsius. So that mathematical operations I just gave to you is known as an affine transformation. So when we talk about things like multiplying and dividing temperatures, that does not make any sense on the Fahrenheit and Celsius scale. Why? Well, I'll give you an example. If I had 0 degrees Celsius, that's equal to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. What is 2 times 0? 2 times 0 degrees Celsius is still 0. What is 2 times 32 degrees Fahrenheit? 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Is 64 degrees Fahrenheit equal to 0 degrees Celsius? No, it's not. It is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a great example to show you that affine transformations are permissible, but other sorts of multiplicative factors or divisional factors, fractions, etc., those kinds of factors are not applicable to that of cardinal metrics. So this is really important when we get to talking about happiness studies. The last kind of scale we'll look at, though there are many others, is the ratio scale. So for those who've done a bit of physics, you know about the Kelvin scale. So the Kelvin scale allows you to talk about absolute zero, for example. So the 0 point is a non-arbitrary 0 point. The reason I say it's non-arbitrary is because that is where there is zero mean molecular motion. That's when there's absolutely no movement at the level, at the theoretical limit, where atoms aren't even moving. And this is important because if you look at the Celsius scale, the 0 degree is actually not the absolute zero. That's just where water freezes. That was just chosen for historical reasons in the 18th and early 19th century. And again, we can't get into that, but the 0 point is arbitrary compared to in the Kelvin scale where the 0 point is completely non-arbitrary. And this actually allows you to do multiplication and division of temperature. So you can actually say this is twice as hot than this on the Kelvin scale, but you can't sensibly do that in any meaningful sense with the Fahrenheit and Celsius scales. So having given you this taxonomy of different measurement scales, this will allow you to have some understanding of the way in which happiness metrics are constructed, typically along either ordinal or cardinal scales. So before we get into talking about how exactly these happiness and well-being metrics are constituted from a technical perspective, I'll just give you a super brief history of the different kinds of scales that have been used. Okay, so I mean, there's things before the 19th century, but we're going to start with the 19th century marginalist economists. So these are people like William Stanley Jevons, Francis Ysidro Edgeworth, and people like, to an extent, Irving Fisher, though, as you would see later, Irving Fisher actually rejected certain psychologizations, of well-being and happiness. He instead had a preference idea or a desire-based theory of well-being. But economists at this time, specifically those active in what we'd now call microeconomics, were very active in trying to produce different measures of economic welfare as tied to hedonic welfare. So how kind of the extent at which consumption of goods and services produces a positive sensory affect on your body overall. So in the 1870s, this was particularly popular. In the 20th century and going even into the 21st century, we get this notion of experience sampling. So we'll talk a bit about that later on, where you have psychologists who are essentially giving you a device that, when prompted randomly throughout the day, is to ask you, how are you feeling? And so that's a way that psychologists, you just kind of wear it on yourself as you're going about your daily life, and then you kind of like discreetly write down how happy you are at the specific instantaneous moment the beeper goes off. So that allows psychologists to get essentially random sample of how happy you are throughout the entirety of your daily waking experience. We then have the Alan Kruger, unfortunately passed away a few years ago, former economist at Princeton University. Alan Kruger has this U index. So that U stands for unhappiness index. We'll talk about later what the details of that look like. We have the World Happiness Report, largely out of the University of British Columbia, amongst other universities, that looks at exactly what it sounds like. We're looking at the happiness of different countries and how people are doing in that regard. We have the Happy Planet Index. We have a philosopher, Wayne Davis, talking about his notion of subjective well-being and net welfarism. And we have a happiness psychologist, Ed Diener, writing in 1985 about the satisfaction with life scale. So there's many different kinds of well-being metrics that we're going to look at. I just thought I'd just give you a brief history of that. Having looked at the brief history, we can get into the details of one of these metrics known as the Cantril Ladder. Okay, so what's going on with the Cantril Ladder? The Cantril Ladder asks the following question. Okay, so psychologists and economists are going out asking people the following question. From 1 to 10, with 10 best possible life and 1 worst possible life, how happy are you today? So if you think about it right now, suppose I just ask myself, Adrian, how happy are you today? I'm doing pretty good. I would say I slept pretty well, had a nice tasty breakfast, played a little piano, feeling pretty good about myself. I'm going to give myself 8.5 out of 10. It's not the best possible day I could conceive of, and it's very far from the worst possible day I could conceive of. Notice that this is an attempt to produce a cardinal metric in some sense. So why not just an ordinal metric? Well, because I'm not saying that I'm happier by this amount. I'm saying that I can equally increment in units of 1 saying that the distance from 1 to 2 happiness is the same as the distance from 2 to 3 happiness, which is the same distance from 3 to 4 happiness, namely units of 1, 1, 1, 1, that we could actually sum up our degrees of happiness. Now, notice that this is controversial because it seems like, well, can I really know the exact difference between 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 on this subjective measure of happiness? It seems really unclear. When I said 8.5, how do I know that that's 8.5 and not 8.4? Do I have clear introspective access to my own mental states? Am I even fully aware of how happy or unhappy I am? In fact, there seems to be some empirical evidence to suggest that we are not as aware of how happy we are in the way that we think we are. So I'll just give you one example that I read about. One example I read about is that you can survey people on how happy they are, and what the experimentalists will do is they'll have an ambient noise generator. So it could be like a fan or something in the background. And they find that when people introduce that fan into the environment in the experimental group versus the control group, and again, when they introduce it, they don't tell them. Again, it's just hidden in the background. They find that the average happiness is actually reported to be a little bit lower, even though people don't recognize that there is this fan. So that shows you that your stress levels, maybe from your job or from your environment at large, your physical environment at large, can have a subconscious factor on your environment. So again, you need to ask the question, whenever you encounter a happiness metric, is this justified, firstly? If so, how is it justified? I mean, there could be a justification for this, but you have to ask yourself in what way. Secondly, is this objective? So notice how actually hypersubjective the Cantril Ladder score actually is. For example, my 10 out of 10 and my 1 out of 10, the endpoints of my metric are going to be very different than yours. So, for example, suppose you come from a war-torn country. Your conception of worst possible life is a lot different than mine is. Suppose you grew up really wealthy and you had a wonderful family and you had all these things going for you. Your conception of the best possible life is going to be a lot different than what mine is. So it seems that everyone, when being asked this question, will have different endpoints of the scale. Their 10 out of 10, their 1 out of 10 is going to be completely different than my 1 out of 10 and my 10 out of 10. And that causes problems for the objectivity of this measurement. Secondly, you might also ask, is this intersubjectively verifiable? Again, can anyone check to see how happy I am? All you'd have to do is you'd have to be able to ask me questions verbally. After all, you can't just scan my brain. As you'll see maybe later on, there are some neuroscientists who do think that something like this is possible. Very few think that it's actually possible now, but they think maybe in theory it would be possible for us to come up with a brain scanner to detect how happy or well off we are. But again, the point being is that the intersubjective verifiability of these measures of happiness is highly fraught. It's really unclear that this makes any sense, this is possible in any way, right? After all, you just ask a person, and you have to rely on them to accurately report their happiness. Secondly, that they can avoid confounding subconscious factors that bias their reports. And thirdly, there's no direct way to measure happiness. Happiness is a very abstract mental state. Well, again, it just depends on your philosophy of well-being. Some people think it's not even your mental state, right? It's whether your preferences are satisfied, various other factors. So it's unclear how to do a science of well-being if the intersubjective verifiability of something like a Cantril Ladder score is compromised. So again, just kind of looking at the Cantril Ladder in a little bit more detail. So you can see this kind of life satisfaction scale from 0 to 10. And what you're having here is basically 3 general categories that you can fall under: thriving, struggling, or suffering. But as we noted before, there's a lot of problems with these metrics. Perhaps there's some days in which you're suffering, but you're net positive on other days. So perhaps the variance of your distribution of Cantril Ladder scores actually is a very large variance and large range compared to that of other people. And so looking at a person's Cantril Ladder score at an instantaneous time slice of their life may not tell you much about their life. So you could have a experimentalist coming into a community, administering Cantril Ladder surveys, and the people are reporting like a really severe rates of suffering. They're somewhere in the range of 3 to 0 on this scale, as you can see in this kind of orange vertical line here. But maybe otherwise, maybe there was a recent community disaster that afflicted people that put them in a situation. Otherwise, maybe they're doing fine. So we have to be skeptical also, or not necessarily skeptical, but you just have to raise questions about the context in which these measurements are conducted. So that's why I think it's important to talk a bit about the philosophy and also technical aspects of the extent to which these measurements are justified or unjustified. As you've seen, there are problems for the idea that this should be understood as a justified cardinal metric, the idea that you can sum happiness in some Cantril Ladder scores, because the increments from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, there's no way to know whether we have an accurate means of precisely quantifying our own subjective happiness that we can talk about equally distributed gradations. Notice that, again, in the case of temperature, this is possible. We know the expansion of mercury is roughly linear as a substance in glass thermometers. That allows you to say that the difference between 0 Celsius and 1 Celsius, 1 Celsius to 2 Celsius, 2 to 3 Celsius, 51 to 52 Celsius, all these gradations are equal measurements of a single 1-unit interval. In the case of happiness, it's actually not clear. Maybe it's actually exponentially distributed. Maybe it's not linearly distributed. And so there's a lot of questions about the metaphysics of conscious experience, which are really deep. You could write a whole dissertation on that, and the metaphysics of happiness in terms of a mental state that require scrutiny and philosophical analysis. So when you look at scales like this, you do have to ask these questions. Otherwise, it compromises the alleged scientific objectivity of these studies. And you read these reports in the news saying Denmark and Finland and Norway are the happiest countries on earth. You got to raise skepticism and concerns about whether these metrics make any sense, depending on whether or not they can justify the measurement constructs that underpin those studies or not. Another measure we're going to look at to distinguish it from happiness metrics is actually depression scores. So I'm not denying that depression has something to do with happiness. I'm saying depression for the purposes of the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual of the American Psychiatric and Psychological Associations. Those are distinct ways of measuring things, okay? So they measure depression as follows. This is from DSM-5, that is version 5. So a major depressive episode occurs when 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. So you have to have at least one of those two things, and then 3 or more of the other sorts of things. 4 or more of the other things. So depressed most of the day, nearly every day is indicated by subjective report, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities, etc., etc., etc. So here's a way in which psychiatrists and psychologists tend to measure depression. Now notice this is not a quantitative measure, rather it's what you call a nominal measure. It's nominal because it's saying amongst a different set of labeled categories, so long as you have 5 or more of these kinds of things, with at least one being depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure, that you're considered depressed. So we can't even talk about increments of depression here. You're either just depressed or you're not depressed according to this specific metric. There are other depression scales that you might look at that allow you, well, allow might be a bit strong, but they claim to have a ordinal or cardinal metric. In this case, it's purely nominal. It's just whether or not you satisfy the various categories or not. And it's not a question of the degree at which you satisfy those categories. So it's an on or off kind of thing. You're either a major depressive episode or you are not. So before I get to talking about other metrics that I want to talk about, I want to briefly talk about my own idea. Okay, so a little bit of self-promotion here. One way I like to think about individual well-being is along the following 3 general axes, okay? So we have this stress-calmness axis, we have this boredom and engagement axis, and we also have this pleasure and pain axis. So the basic idea behind this is that individual subjective well-being should include at least the following 3 factors. It should include the degree at which you are stressed and calm. After all, stress and calm is very different than pleasure and pain. You could be super stressed but having a lot of pleasure. It's unlikely, but it is possible. You could be, for example, in a hurry, but you're also enjoying the taste of ice cream. So you're having pleasurable sensations, but you're also clearly stressed because you're running late for a work meeting. We also have this boredom engagement axis, so that's really important. There's some people who are experiencing a lot of pleasure, and perhaps they're super calm, but they're super bored. Okay, so you're going to imagine a person, you're just waiting in a lobby room, and you're just snacking on some candy, so you're pleasured. You're very calm, you're not stressed, but you're super, super bored. So again, I mentioned this three-dimensional axis, actually four-dimensional, because we'll talk about the single dimension for time in just a moment, in which you can situate yourself in this three-dimensional phase space. It's not a three-dimensional physical space because we're not talking about Euclidean space of x, y, z coordinates. We're talking about a phase space composed of different measures of well-being. So in this sense, you can be super engaged or super bored. You could be stressed or calm, or you could also be pleasure or in pain and this sort of thing. And so, like I said, this is a four-dimensional phase space because you also want to include time. So the time at which you are situated in this space. You can imagine this four-dimensional phase space in which your entire life goes through this trajectory of well-being distributed over time. Okay, so again, this is just a very theoretical framework for you to think about, but I do think that there is something to this idea. And to give credit where credit's due, I was inspired by some kind of initial thoughts that the philosopher Daniel Hebron had in his book, The Pursuit of Unhappiness, which, despite its name, isn't what you think it is, but that's what it's called, in which he talks a little bit about things related to this. So it was me that kind of came up with this basic idea of having this different kind of axis, but Hebron has the initial philosophical framework to think about alternative measures of well-being that inspired me to think about this. So I want to give credit where credit's due. Go check out the work of Daniel Hebron. Having talked about a few individual subjective well-being metrics, we have to talk about some of the philosophical problems that arise from the scientific perspective here. So what's going on is that if you consider, for example, the depression score, we have a phenomenon known as multiple realizability. Now, multiple realizability has strengths and weaknesses. That is, when a measuring scale has multiple realizability, there's some good and bad things that can happen. So we consider temperature. Temperature is not multiply realizable. Why? Because when you have a temperature reading of 22 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit or something like this, it's telling you that the mean molecular motion of the expansion of mercury is occurring in a certain kind of way. And so when that happens, you're going to have a single measurement output. It's going to say, it's 84 degrees Fahrenheit, is 22 degrees Celsius, something like that, just to use an example. Now notice that in the case of the depression score, that is not the case. You can have two people with completely different psychologically distinct profiles. That is, a person satisfies various aspects of the DSM definition of major depressive episode. Someone else satisfies the other ones that are distinct from that. And then both nonetheless are categorized as being in a state of a major depressive episode. In my opinion, that's a problem. Because, to make it a bit more explicit, look, for example, at the third bullet point on my slide here. Imagine that you have A, B, C, D, E. That is, you have 5 different categories here, going from left to right. And the 1 or a 0 is whether or not you satisfy that category that is a symptom of major depressive episode. So in this case, if you look at the person on the left has 1, 0, 1, 1, 0. That means they satisfy condition A, they don't satisfy condition B, they satisfy condition C, D, and they do not satisfy condition E. And the other person has a distinct profile. The only overlap they have is in condition D. They both have condition D. But otherwise, they share distinct A, B, C, and E categories. Now, so long as they satisfy the correct number of scores, that is, you have to have 5 or more. So forgive me, I just use this as a toy example. I really should have had a larger dimensional phase space for this that had at least, maybe 10 or something different categories. But so long as they satisfy 5 or more different ones of the symptoms for major depressive episode, that is sufficient for them to be classified as being depressed. And again, that's a problem because you have two people with completely different psychological profiles, that are nonetheless being classified as depressed. It's a problem because, again, you want a measurement construct to give you an informative answer about the underlying symptoms or features that are causing the person to be in a state of depression. So if you have someone that's saying, I'm depressed, but they're depressed for two completely different reasons, you might think, well, that can be a problem because we want to have a metric that can actually distinguish between two different kinds of depressions. So there are two choices you have. Either you think that this is a strength, namely that it's a positive thing that a metric can show you that there's a plurality of different kinds of things that can nonetheless lead to the same disease category, or you think that this metric is problematic. You think actually there's two different kinds of depressions happen here. It's not that there's one and the same depression that has two different sets of underlying symptoms. It's to say that actually maybe there's two different kinds of depressions that are happening here. So multiple realizability is very common in social scientific metrics in a way that is not as common in the natural sciences. All right, so having talked about individual well-being metrics, we now need to talk about social well-being metrics. So to start off our discussion, let's use the following quote from Thomas Jefferson, well-known American politician. "The care of human life and happiness is the only legitimate object of good government." Wow, that's a really explicit statement here with respect to the public policy perspective of Thomas Jefferson. So he's saying good government has to be interested in the care of human life and happiness. Notice that that is not necessarily correlated, though in practice it tends to be. That's not necessarily correlated nor necessitates the activity of high GDP growth, low wealth inequality, etc., etc. So long as people are happy and living a good human life, that is the only legitimate object of good government in Jefferson's eyes. So as you're going to see, a lot of social scientists prefer holistic measures of what makes society well off. So it's not just about happiness and life satisfaction. It's going to include economic factors and political factors and informational factors. So to cite one well-known statistic that's described a lot in the economics of happiness, we have here Richard Easterlin's paradox, which says that income is correlated with happiness only to a certain threshold. And so we notice this in various different kinds of countries. Some countries are really well off, like the United States, or a better example, in my opinion, is probably like Norway. So they have very high Human Development Index scores, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they tend to be strongly correlated with being happy, if you read about surveys. That being said, there's going to be a certain point at which it seems not to make that much of a difference. So the marginal difference in happiness that allows a person to come from absolute poverty to lower or middle class, that income increase is proportional to a large increase in happiness. But that difference between an upper middle class person and a filthy rich person, that difference in happiness is actually not as much, even if they increase by, suppose, another $1 billion. So a person who has $50 billion goes to $51 billion, even though that $1 billion is a lot of money. The difference of that increase doesn't contribute a lot to their increase in happiness compared to someone going from making less than 20,000 USD per year, which is below the poverty line in the United States, to someone making 50,000 USD per year. So that increase in happiness tends to be a lot greater at the lower aspects of the measurement regime compared to the larger aspects of the measurement regime at much higher measurement values. Another thing we should note before we continue is that the philosophy of social well-being is distinct from that of the philosophy of individual well-being, because that the whole is not to be equal to the sum of the parts. So we have this quote from one of my favorite economists, Francis Isidro Edgeworth, active in the 19th century. "For in the arithmetic of hedonism, the whole is not to be equal to the sum of the parts, but to the sum plus the relations of the parts." So this is why sociological theory is so important. Your psychologist will not be as educated on social relations between people as will be a sociologist. Sociologists study social relations. They're going to know about things like class structure, the impact racism has on people, understanding human relationships to one another rather than just as individuals. So it's really important to have a sociological and holistic analysis of individual and social well-being, and that's why Edgeworth is saying that the whole is not to be confused with the mere sum of the individual parts. After all, you can imagine a society in which everyone's individually happy, but the society is still struggling with a lot of problems. So we'll get to an example of that in just a moment here. So like I said, we could talk about a situation in which people are individually happy, but jointly they're maybe not doing so well off. So I'm going to use an example. An example is going to be from that of Mexico, modern Mexico. So many modern Mexicans lead disproportionately happy lives as individuals, okay? You can look at the 2016 Happy Planet Index studies for them, ranking them second in the world, okay? So individually people are ranking super happy. However, as anyone knows, whether you live in Mexico or you observe Mexican society, Mexico confronts significant social and political issues, okay? You have journalists who are routinely assassinated, there's conflicts, there's high wealth inequality, systematic violence issues, high rates of crime, and widespread corruption in municipal and federal government, okay? So I'm not saying absolutely every Mexican city or place has these features. It does tend to, I do mean to say, though, that there does tend to be this phenomenon happening at a socio-political level in Mexico as a country overall. So that shows you that social well-being is low despite individual happiness being very high. Analogously, according to the 2019 World Happiness Report, Costa Rica is ranked 12th happiest country in the period of 2016 to 2018. So again, that's given individually distributed Cantril Ladder score surveys of the kind I showed you earlier. And yet the country scores comparatively low on negative affect, that is unhappiness. So remember that happiness and unhappiness are actually different. You can have days where you're really happy and days where you're super neutral, and you have other days where you're happy and then you're also sad. And so notice that the neutrality is an absence of happiness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're unhappy. Unhappy is a different kind of state altogether, which is why the World Happiness Report is measuring negative affect as distinct from positive affect. So in Costa Rica, there's actually a wide variance, apparently, of the happiness and negativity of their life experience overall. And they're scoring comparatively low on that. They're ranked 87th on negative affect scores. And the political categories of social support and corruption are a lot lower, at 42nd and 58th, respectively, compared to the relatively high individual well-being ranking at 12th happiest country in that sense. So notice that individual happiness is going to diverge from that of the social well-being of the country as a whole. So that's why I use the example of modern Mexico and Costa Rica to illustrate these points. As I promised earlier, we'd talk about the Human Development Index. So the Human Development Index is a very well-known, especially commonly used in the United Nations Development and Poverty Analyses. It's a measure of overall social well-being of a country, and it basically uses three different variables. It uses life expectancy at birth, GDP per capita, and mean schooling years. That's what MSY stands for. So what you're going to do is you're going to multiply each of the values for each of these things. So you're going to first come up with a measurement construct for life expectancy. You're going to come up with a measurement construct for GDP, and then you're going to come up with a measurement construct for the mean schooling years, the average number of years that a person in that country has attended formal education. You're going to multiply all three of those numbers, and then you're going to take what's known as the cube root of that. Okay, so that's going to be the mathematical side of the Human Development Index, and this will produce a number. So to give you an example of some countries that are scoring really high on the HDI, the Human Development Index, Norway, to an extent Canada, Finland, the Scandinavian countries are just doing extremely well in this regard. Another UN-sanctioned metric that's used to estimate social well-being, which looks at things like natural capital and how well the environment is going in that country, is the Inclusive Wealth Index. Okay, so this is much more mathematically complicated. It basically takes this infinite integral. For those who've studied a bit of math, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, then you'll have to study a bit of math to understand that. But it's going to be this intertemporal well-being function of a society at a given time t. Okay, and it's going to be a kind of discount rate. The idea being that given initial inputs into manufactured capital, which is what MC stands for, human capital, which is what HC stands for, NC stands for natural capital, and T stands for time, that given that the society's current rates of manufactured capital, human capital, natural capital, etc., that you would discount future value relative to the present value. So what that means is that our society is more concerned about current measures of manufactured capital, that is industry, the general economic situation, versus the human capital, which is education, the workforce, etc., and then natural capital, which is the amount of natural resources and environmental sustainability that you have. You care more about the present value than necessarily the future. That's not to say you don't care about the future at all. It's just say that you care less and less about far distant futures, maybe 300 years, 400 years, 5,000 years, etc. So that's why if you look at the mathematical function here, you're going to be multiplying the societal utility function, which is a function of the aggregate consumption of each of those values that I mentioned before, and it's going to have this negative exponential distribution with respect to the discount rate. And you're going to sum up all those values using the integral as follows to compute the inclusive wealth. Okay, so again, that's a very technical metric, but it is an example of the social well-being measures that are commonly employed in the most recent history, maybe 5 odd years, of the United Nations. And Partha Dasgupta, who is an economist at Cambridge, is one of the people that's principally responsible for constructing this inclusive wealth index. So as I mentioned before, we talked a lot about the value theory of well-being. But now we need to talk a bit about the general philosophy of well-being, specifically the philosophy of science aspects of well-being. So I know I already talked a bit about that when it comes to measurement, but we need to think about other kind of general philosophical questions that pertain to the science of well-being. Okay, so why do we need a philosophy of well-being? Because natural and social scientists themselves are too busy studying well-being to notice any controversies or methodological issues in the foundations of that science. After all, a science can only proceed if its foundations are rigorous and sound. And for those who've studied the history of social science, you'll notice that there are revolutions in social science. So I'll give you one example from psychiatry. Up until 1973, homosexuality was considered a disease category. It was considered deviant from the perspective of the American Psychiatric Association. After 1973, and in the year 1973, they decided, no, this is bullshit, that this is actually not a legitimate disease category. You have many homosexuals who are perfectly happy, living fulfilling lives. They're not subject to any of these kinds of, they are subjected to, but they don't actually practice any of the stereotypes. They don't realize any of the negative stereotypes people had at the time. So that's why it's important for philosophers to come in to actually scrutinize the foundations of a natural social science. So just because it seems like there's all this progress happening, no, there could be like completely misled. Maybe they took a completely wrong turn methodologically, and actually we need to go back to the foundations and look at that to see what is justified and what is not justified. So philosophers of social science, myself included, are typically trained in the science. They have a lot of training in that. They've done a lot of reading on that. They've been evaluated by experts, such that it allows them to look at the foundations. And as we know, happiness and well-being are value-laden sciences. It's not like when you study electrons. No one cares about electrons. Electrons are not stakeholders in society. Electrons are inert objects that have no mental properties. They have no values. There are no moral or political questions that go into the physicist's analysis of the natural world. In the same way, there are values in happiness studies. Obviously, happiness is highly contentious, right? So when it gets to measuring happiness and thinking about happiness, it's clearly a value-laden science. Therefore, there's going to be subjective moral and political biases that go into the psychologist or economist's head as they try to measure and think about happiness and well-being overall. After all, what is happiness is a super deep question, which is why we need to do some value theory in philosophy, and we need to do some philosophy of science about how to measure and understand scientific controversies behind measuring well-being. So now we're going to get the chance to talk about Anna Alexandrova's view. So, as I said, Anna Alexandrova is a professor at University of Cambridge's History and Philosophy of Science department. She's published a lot on this topic. So she thinks that it has approached the status of what is known as a normal science, to use a term from Thomas Kuhn. There's an agreed upon set of rules for inquiry. That is, the science has reached a state where there's not enough controversy for it to threaten the kind of normal proceedings of scientific investigation. That's not to say there's no controversy. It's just to say that there's comparatively less controversy and the foundations are stable enough that economists and psychologists think that they're justified. Again, I'm going to use the word think because you yourself might think from our previous discussions about all the issues that I was flagging before, that actually maybe these sciences are not as stable as they seem to be. But the mainstream consensus is that there is a lot of justification for at least the core inner framework for the natural and social science of happiness and well-being. Notice that it's a mixed science. Well-being and happiness studies includes natural and social sciences. That is, you can't do the happiness you can't do the psychology of happiness without having some understanding of the biology of happiness as well. It's going to combine aspects of what is known in philosophy as naturalism and interpretivism. It's going to include components of naturalism because we're going to need to rely upon the methods and the philosophy of natural sciences, whether it be intersubjective verifiability of metrics, whether it be robust measurement constructs and quantitative methods, as well as what is known as the interpretive aspects of sociology and philosophical anthropology. Why? Because we're going to need to interpret agents in society, and we're going to need to interview them linguistically, ask them questions, we're going to need to observe their behavior, etc., and construct some narrative of what it is that's making their life well off and not well off. Notice that there's no clearly objective way to do this, but there's going to be more objective and lesser objective ways to interpret people. So it's really important that we are sensitive to the fact that happiness studies does combine naturalism with interpretivism aspects to its methods. There are going to be some value-free aspects and some value-laden aspects, and it's also going to combine normative with descriptive components. So a normative claim is to say things ought to be this way. A descriptive claim is different, saying this is in fact how things are. Okay, so saying that there is a water bottle here is the descriptive claim. A normative claim is saying, well, Adrian, since you're kind of thirsty right now and your throat's a little parched from talking so much, you ought to take a sip, which I will do right now. So to continue our discussion, we need to use some philosophical terminology. So let's talk about, for example, construct validity. A measurement procedure is construct valid if and only if that measurement procedure satisfies its intended purpose. So you can imagine that in developing a measurement of something, so I'll use examples from the history of temperature measurement, that you try to measure something, but it doesn't end up actually doing what you wanted it to do. So I'll give you an example. Two examples in the 1700s is that they wanted to try to measure temperature using whether or not butter melts and by what degree butter melts. Now, the problem with that is that butter is not a substance that is going to expand or contract or melt or freeze or expand in any of these ways linearly. You want a linear metric. So, and because butter behaves in very different kinds of circumstances and it's subject to bacterial factors, etc., it's not a good way to measure temperature. So it has low construct validity. Another example is that in the history of temperature measurement, they tried to use water. So instead of putting mercury inside of glass thermometers in the way that we understand thermometers today, there used to be attempts to put water. So you just put water, but again, water doesn't have the properties. It's like it's just jostling around. It's not like mercury, which is a very stable atomic element compared to water. So water also had low construct validity when it comes to temperature. So when you're constructing a happiness metric, ask yourself, is the metric construct valid? Does it satisfy its intended purpose? We're going to talk a little bit later about how exactly that's done. But before we do that, we have to talk about this idea of robustness. So a measurement is robust if we get the same measurement reading from multiple independent means. That is, there's multiple independent sources and measurement procedures that nonetheless return the same measurement outcome. So for those who know a little bit about the history of physics and chemistry, you probably heard of Avogadro's constant. In the history of Avogadro's constant, there were many different ways in which Avogadro's constant was calculated. And so that is an example of a robust measuring construct because we had measurement outcomes for that constant that were obtained from multiple independent means. So notice that when we start to do happiness questionnaires, etc., they're going to be problematic because there's going to be questions to what extent they satisfy construct validity and whether or not they are robust. So to understand some of the problems with questionnaires, we're going to look at a 2012 paper from Anna. So to quote, a measure M of a construct C is validated to the extent that M behaves in a way that respects three sources of evidence. A, M is inspired by a plausible theory of C specified in some initial stage of inquiry. So that's at the beginning. B, subjects reveal M to track C through their questionnaire answering behavior. And C, other knowledge about C is consistent with variations in values of M across other contexts, and measurement methods M prime. Okay, that's a lot of technical philosophical jargon I just threw at you. So what exactly does this mean in a bit more simple terms? Well, when you're going to construct a measure of happiness, you have to first start off with an intuitive idea of how you might measure it. Okay, so you just make a guess. You think, okay, you know what? I think happiness should be measured by asking people on their satisfaction with life. So you administer a questionnaire and survey. So you ask them the question. The next step is you need to make sure that the answers that they give to that, in light of what you know about those subjects, is consistent with your intuitive conception of what the intended construct was for. So suppose people are like giving completely ridiculous answers to your question, and you know and you observe them, they seem to be having a good time, then it seems like the questionnaire is maybe broken in some sense. Maybe you're phrasing the question wrong. Maybe you're administering it in like a highly biased manner. I don't know. So that's the second stage. And the third stage is once you've gathered all that data from your novel measurement construct, ask yourself whether that data is consistent with other metrics that you know to provide evidence of that you do think are construct valid of measures of happiness. Okay, so you're going to have, when you create a new construct for happiness, there's obviously going to be other people who are also proposing constructs of happiness. And so insofar as you think that those other metrics are justified, you need to make sure that the data set that you have after you've collected the data is itself relatively consistent with what you would expect those results to be in light of other data that have also been collected on the same sample group. So more precisely, first step is assemble all the intended questions, eliminate similar questions, have multiple people respond multiple times to that questionnaire, perform statistics such as which are correlated, where correlation is understood to be Pearson correlation. Are they time dependent? So does it depend on which time you ask this kind of question? Which questions predict overall score? What is the retest reliability? When you give someone the test again, are they giving similar results? And lastly, you want to use questions that survive the process 1 to 4 as going to be the set of questions that you're going to have in your final survey. Again, I'm just showing you the kind of process that social scientists have to go through when they construct a completely novel measure of well-being and happiness. So there's a ton of problems that can be encountered at any stage of this process. For example, questions are not decided by subjects. It's only researchers that are deciding what the questions are. Maybe actually individual human subjects, such as random civilians in countries like the US or Canada, maybe they have actually better questions that they would ask about themselves than what the researcher would ask. So maybe the researcher is just not thinking outside the box and they're asking highly simplified or useless questions, and that's why they're getting useless data. There can also be linguistic translation issues cross-culturally. So if you give a Cantril Ladder score survey to a Canadian and you translate the question, how satisfied are you with your life, and you give it to a Mongolian or, I don't know, a Japanese person, how do you know that you translated the question correctly into Japanese? After all, different languages have different semantic terms and vocabulary for how to articulate happiness, well-being, hedonic affect, etc. So issues can happen at the level of translation. A third issue is algebraic issues. How do you know that you've mathematically justified your metric? A lot of philosophy and a lot of mathematics and a lot of statistics goes into the construct validity of measurements of happiness. And you can have tons of debates about this, as we saw before. Alexandrova suggests that maybe we need to open interviews instead of packaged questions. So we need to perhaps have a situation where we ask people, and you can draw upon sociologists and anthropologists' work on happiness studies, and maybe bring an anthropologist or sociologist with you as a psychologist into a community, and you get them to have open interviews talking about what makes their life well off or not, rather than having these pre-packaged questions that you just administer unilaterally. And lastly, there's general questions about, are people really reliable judges of their own well-being? So maybe I'm like totally wrong that I'm having such a great day today. Right? So insofar as that's a skeptical worry you might have, you would think that the construct validity is compromised as a result of my inability to introspect about my own mental states. So it's an open question if any of these problems are actually resolvable. That's why it's important to do the philosophy of happiness studies. So in Anna's view, philosophers can do constitutive work. It's the scientists, that is natural and social scientific practitioners, that do the causal work. So what does that mean? Philosophers can contribute to the discussion about what well-being is and how it's constituted by talking about different theories of value, right? And that's really important because when you go out and do a scientific study, you have to first have some understanding of the underlying phenomena that is you're studying before you start saying that this thing is caused by these other things. And so philosophers can come in and try to contribute to these discussions alongside natural and social scientific practitioners by doing the constitutive work and scrutinizing the value theory. Anna thinks that there isn't enough what are known as mid-level theories of well-being. So we've talked a lot about individual well-being and broader social well-being, but have we talked enough about these so-called mid-level theories of well-being? So that looks like something like a well-being of children, a well-being of soldiers, the well-being of plumbers, mothers, politicians, lawyers, doctors, etc. So I think she's totally right. There isn't enough work that's been done in the sociology or economics or psychology of happiness that looks at distinct categories of well-being that apply to social classes of people. Okay, so much energy has been expended on general Homo sapien well-being, or like general average human well-being, while ignoring the fact that we each fall into different social categories. And these social categories will have different constitutive and causal features that allow us to thrive and fail to thrive in life. So that's really important to think about. Maybe we need more mid-level theories of well-being. And again, it takes someone like a philosopher such as Anna to come in and to think about things like this. And lastly, there's going to be a lot of questions about construct pluralism. So you see some of these debates in the economics and psychology of happiness where they're just like dead set on choosing one construct. And they're saying, this construct, maybe satisfaction of life scale, is just the best construct. Maybe that's totally wrong. Maybe actually there's going to be multiple equally valid and important and enriching ways in which we can study the exact same phenomena. So perhaps having construct pluralism is actually more important in a way than natural and social scientific practitioners think is the case in contemporary well-being studies. All right, having talked about Anna's view, we should talk now about Erik Angner's view. So Erik Angner wrote this wonderful paper, Is It Possible to Measure Happiness?, published in the European Journal of Philosophy of Science in 2013. And Angner's going to survey a bit of the history of this question, and he's going to give his own response to the question itself. So overall, the argument of the paper looks like this. First premise, measurement requires transitivity. That's not his claim, but it is the claim of a lot of development economists and sociologists and psychologists especially on the question. I'll talk a bit later about what is meant by transitivity. Second premise is happiness cannot be measured using transitively ordered measurement constructs. This is a premise Angner himself agrees with. Third, therefore happiness cannot be measured. Fourth, but happiness can clearly be measured, right? I mean, clearly we have measurements of happiness all the time. Whether or not they're justified is another question, but they seem to be at least possible in some sense. Hence, either premise 1 or premise 2 is false, and Angner thinks actually premise 1 is false. Measurement does not require transitivity. So in order to proceed further with Angner's argument, we have to backtrack a bit and talk again about the mental state account of well-being. So according to this account, well-being is a property of your mind. Okay, it's not a property of your general relationship to other people. It's entirely a property of your satisfaction and individual happiness. The preference satisfaction account says that well-being happens when your preferences are satisfied, even if you're not happy. Okay, so you can have people have a desire to do certain things that don't give them that much happiness, but they maybe relieve stress or something else. So that's another different kind of account here. So Angner claims that the history of economics and well-being studies until the 20th century accepted the mental state account and then eventually adopted the so-called preference account because mental states are allegedly unmeasurable. So you get a lot of people like Irving Fisher who think it's unmeasurable, and other kinds of economists, as you'll see later on. So economists started to think utility cannot be measured directly in the mind, but only measured via observable behavior. To quote Beckerman, no science can tell us whether modern man is happier than mankind 100 years ago or even 10 years ago. The concept of happiness is one for which there can be no scientific objective measure whatsoever. So these are super strong words coming from Beckerman, who's a social scientist. And like I said earlier, Irving Fisher, who is a prominent economist, actually the first economics PhD to be ever offered in the United States in 1891 at Yale University, Irving Fisher would defend in his dissertation the idea that it's not possible to measure happiness. All we can do is actually measure people's desire through their preferences, their outwardly displayed behavior, rather than their mental states. To reference one other figure in the history of well-being studies, we have here Georg Simmel, which is a well-known German sociologist. He says, the assertion that there is in life a considerable excess of suffering over happiness, it is quite impossible to make such an assertion, which presupposes that pleasure and pain can be directly balanced and set off against each other as two qualitatively equal magnitudes with opposite signs. There is no common measure. We cannot experience what amount of pleasure would be necessary to compensate for the suffering. So notice that there's two components to this. First is a clear rejection of the welfarist view that I talked about earlier, that you can sum positive and negative mental states. Secondly, there's a skepticism about the extent to which we ourselves can even know what is going to offset the happiness and displeasure in our lives. And Simmel's saying this because, in my opinion, he's a kind of careful thinker about this. It actually is really hard to think about the joyful bike ride that you might have had in the afternoon and then the horrible news that you heard about a natural disaster occurring in your home country, and then the pleasure you get from an ice cream. How can you talk about what is going to offset or not one or the other kind of experience? So Simmel's another example of this kind of skepticism about being able to measure happiness in the history of social science. By way of contrast, we have in 2018 Fossas claiming that you can actually equivocate positive valence with the absence of negative valence. To quote, happiness is conceptualized in the SWB, that is subjective well-being measure, as the presence of pleasant or positive internal feeling states, absence of unpleasant or negative internal feeling states, and self-assessed satisfaction with one's life. So in this case, while there is a distinction from the perspective of the methodology of happiness, we can actually sum and subtract overall well-being and treat them as along as one unified, linearly ordered axis, happiness and unhappiness. So Angner kind of continues by saying, in agreeing with Anna and the kind of intuitive view, well-being is at the intersection of economic psychology and philosophy, and it involves multiple different kind of philosophical angles, which is why we have this discussion of marginalism, operationalism, and utilitarianism. The welfarist may want a measurable and interpersonally comparable metric of well-being because it's really important for policy purposes, right? But it's one thing to want something, it's another thing to actually justify that we can actually have that thing, right? Okay, so The welfarist wants to have a measurable and interpersonally comparable metric because you want to say that Adrian is happier than Susan or Steve or Jason or she or Muhammad, etc. That's why you want an interpersonally comparable metric. And you also obviously want it to be measurable to begin with. That's super desirable. So I know I just gave you some examples of like all these skeptical worries, but obviously we want a measure. But this debate is a problem in the philosophy of science, and it's not an empirical problem. Why? Because it's a foundational problem. In order for you to do empirical science, you have to first solve all these controversies or provide an opinion on these controversies before you can go about measuring things, okay? So that's why it's a philosophy of science problem. To what extent welfarism, which is the mainstream view in development economics and in happiness psychology, whether or not that's justified at all. So despite you having all these skeptical worries, the basic argument that Angner wants to analyze is the following argument. First premise, happiness does not require measurability. Secondly, happiness psychologists use latent variables and not observable ones. Thirdly, happiness doesn't admit of transitive quantities. Fourthly, happiness is too easy to measure. And lastly, psychologists commit reification fallacies far too often. So bridging Anna's view with Erik Angner's view, we have the idea that construct validation for latent variables requires the following. An intuitive concept of the target phenomena, right? So you have to have some intuitive way to try to measure, for example, hedonic affect, the pleasure of ice cream. You need a quantitative means of operationalizing your intuitive concepts. So you need some way to operationalize and find a way to measure and construct a measurement procedure in exactly the way that Anna talked about in her paper. Thirdly, you need to test the operationalization, these words are hard to pronounce, on a wide diversity of subjects. Fourthly, checking if the operationalization data has correlations and covariances that cohere with one. For those who study statistics, you know what I'm talking about. Lastly, if four's answer is yes, then construct is valid. Otherwise, it is invalid. Okay, so you're going to need to sift through multiple different constructs and see whether or not these things satisfy a construct validation test for latent variable measures. Latent variables are variables that you cannot directly observe. Rather, you infer them from the results of multiple observable measurement constructs. So you have a sequence of measurement constructs that you can observe in terms of people's behavior, in terms of the things they say and do, in terms of their reports about their subjective mental states. And then you construct this latent variable, which you can't observe, that basically is triangulated from the values of all these observable traits. So as I promised, I would try to explain to you what is meant by the idea that measurement of happiness is not transitive. So the basic idea is this. So we need to talk a bit about the algebra of measurement. So consider a set of objects, okay? We're just going to use like this cup, for example, okay? So you have a set of objects, maybe a cup, you have the bottle, you have my computer mouse, and you want to order them by some observation. So in the observational category that we want to consider is like length, okay? So the length of this cup. You can represent this by a set of mathematical order relations, which we'll represent by this kind of like sideways arrow-looking thing. If the empirical relations satisfy certain properties, then each member of that set A is such that one object bears relation arrow to another, just in case the former is associated with a greater number than the latter. Okay, that's a lot of technical jargon to just throw at you. What does this mean in plain English? Okay, firstly, this is a lot more complicated than you might think, so I'll try to make this simple. So you might think, Adrian, it's so easy to measure the length of this cup. Duh, you just take a measuring stick and you put it up to it. Well, yes and no, because the measurement context in which you measure the cup's length is going to be very different than if you were to measure, for example, the distance, even though they use the same units, which is meters, the distance from Earth to the Sun, or from the Earth to Pluto, or the Earth to Alpha Centauri, some star far off away. The context of measurement, clearly you can't use a sequence of measuring sticks to actually construct, it's not physically possible for you to concatenate all these like meter sticks one by one from here all the way to the Sun or here all the way to Alpha Centauri. So even though you have the sequence of rods that are being concatenated and added, there isn't a clear way to be able to do this for different kinds of distance relations. You instead need to estimate it using other kinds of means of analyzing electromagnetic phenomena, etc., etc. So the reason I mention this is that when you're going to calculate the length of this cup, you have like a completely arbitrary measuring instrument you call a meter stick, you hold it up to it, and then you concatenate it until the endpoints of that match the endpoints of this. So we say that if you have a small little ruler, you can measure it by looking at the 0 point you put here, and then you calculate the number of ticks on the ruler until it hits here, and you say that's the length. Now notice that this measurement procedure is transitive because I can actually take the measurement of this cup, stack another cup on top, and then I can actually sum the length of both cups. That's actually a completely valid measurement procedure because distance is a quantity metaphysically that has the property of being cardinally measured in this sense. This is completely unclear though in happiness. After all, happiness, you can't talk about and hold up a measuring stick to happiness. That doesn't make any sense. So it actually is a puzzle. It's mysterious. It's unclear how it is then we're going to talk about increments of happiness and whether it satisfies the transitivity of ordering relations in the way that calculations of length do. So that's why it's important for us to talk about transitivity and the algebra of measurement. And this is what Angner is getting us to think about in the context of the philosophy of well-being. So I'm going to give you two Angner quotes to kind of summarize this basic viewpoint. Firstly, on the additional assumption, which to my knowledge is shared by all, that there exists no such ordering in the case of happiness, degrees of happiness are completely unmeasurable. Okay, so Angner actually agrees with what he thinks is the consensus view among psychologists, that you can't order happiness in a transitive manner in the same way that you can with a sequence of measuring sticks that you stack on top of each other. That entire measurement approach doesn't make any sense because there's no intersubjectively verifiable measuring instrument that you can hold up to my brain or my internal mind's eye or something that would allow you to measure happiness in that sense. Second quote, within the measurement theoretic approach, it is obvious that subjectively experienced mental states like happiness cannot be measured. And thirdly, not even the most ardent proponents of subjective measures maintain that such measures can be constructed on the basis of observable ordering satisfying conditions like transitivity. So to problematize things even further, there's going to be some empirical data that we need to look at in the context of psychology. So the first data point we need to look at is that people actually make different choices in different contexts. So the point is that what happiness is and how to measure it, its transitivity is actually violated because the mental state that you're in actually is changing so often depending on the context that you're in that it actually confounds the measurement of happiness. So if I ask you how happy you are when you wake up, and I ask you how happy you are when you're riding a bicycle, or if I ask you how happy you are when you haven't eaten in 5 hours, you're going to get different ways in which measurements are going to be taken for happiness. That is, the measurement outcomes when I ask you that question are going to be very different under different contexts. And that actually makes it very difficult to justify the idea that there's going to be significant increments and stable enough increments of the degree of happiness that you can like stack happiness units on top of each other that allows you to add and subtract happiness units. So that's the sense in which cardinal justifications for happiness metrics are actually extremely problematic. Secondly, to quote Krantz, who's a well-known metrologist, that is a mathematician who focuses on the mathematics of measurement theory, choice does indeed depend on the method of testing, and depends especially on how options are framed. Results such as these show that ordering options by choices is no more determinate than ordering overall reading skill by testing on a particular set of materials. So he's talking about, for example, educational metrics and literacy metrics. So he's saying that these problems actually afflict a wide variety of social sciences and not just well-being and happiness studies. To give you two other quotes, Krantz points to empirical results by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman and their co-authors whose work is widely interpreted as showing that real-life choices reflect what is often called normatively irrelevant factors and consequently fail to satisfy the relevant axioms. So that's kind of an expansion upon the previous point I was just making. To quote Rabe in 2002, a lot of decisions are so sensitive to the framing or context of the choice set that it is difficult to associate these decisions as coming from framing or context-free preferences on those choice sets. So microeconomists working with happiness psychologists trying to understand preference satisfaction and well-being are having a really difficult time constructing transitively ordered measurement procedures that would allow you to actually quantify in a cardinally justified measure happiness and well-being. Okay, so this is super context dependent. And if it's context dependent, that makes it very challenging to provide measurements independent of that context to generalize to a person's overall happiness or well-being. So to make things even more problematic for economists working on well-being studies, the core of microeconomic theory is apparently not well supported empirically. Rather, it studies idealized rational agents, which are quite far off from everyday Homo sapiens like you and I. To quote Ken Binmore explicitly denies the predictive power of economics except when the following three conditions are simultaneously satisfied. The problem facing subjects is really, really simple. Incentives are large enough and clearly defined, and time is allowed for trial and error adjustment to happen. And to quote Angner one more time, outside of the social and behavioral sciences, measurement frequently proceeds in the absence of observable orderings in the same way. So the conclusion of Angner's paper is that it is not the case that happiness cannot be measured just because it fails to admit of transitively ordered measurement properties. Thus, one of the most common objections to measuring happiness completely fails. There are actually more serious problems for happiness metrics according to Angner, such as happiness and satisfaction do not track well-being. So he thinks hedonic affect doesn't really track overall well-being. Secondly, there isn't one form of happiness. There's many too diverse measures of happiness, and that makes it really hard to have a science of happiness. And lastly, happiness is just way too easy to measure. It's not that it's difficult, it's actually too easy. So when he says that, he is not saying that it's too easy in the cardinally measurable sense or the ordinally measurable sense. He's saying that there's so many different ways in which people are happy that it just makes it like we're overwhelmed with data. It's very difficult to sift through the data to find objective, intersubjectively verifiable measures of how to measure happiness and well-being. Other serious problems and fallacies that psychologists commit, according to Angner, is trait reification and score reification. So trait reification is the problem where you treat an idea as a real entity. Remember, at the end of the day, scientific models are models. They're just abstract fictions in our minds that allow us to explain and predict things. They're not literally the things of which they represent. So modeling the physics of a water bottle and the density of the plastic, etc., is different than the actual density or substance itself. It's just a model of it. So commonly, psychologists construct the model and they think, oh, happiness just is the model that they constructed, while forgetting that actually, no, it's a model. It represents the thing being represented. Score reification is the problem that a quantitative measure adequately represents an underlying quantity persisting in the entity. And he notes that happiness scholars are guilty of trait reification when they confuse the latent abstract construct, that which is represented by subjective measures, with happiness in that sense of the word that has moral significance and normative import. All right, guys, that's been a whirlwind tour of the methodology of happiness and well-being studies. So here are just some concluding thoughts. I think Anna and Erik both make really compelling arguments, okay? And I think it's important for us to scrutinize carefully the methodological assumptions that go into the construction of measurement for happiness and well-being. A few other things to consider that we didn't spend as much time talking about today because we don't have enough time. I've already spent so much time. Is that aesthetic experiences problematize measures of well-being. So consider, for example, a depressing dramatic film. That clearly contributes to your well-being because it makes you spiritually fulfilled. It gives you some broader outlook on life in general, but it may not make you happy in the moment to watch it. So aesthetic experiences, the same goes for depressing music. Even though they seem to be problems for happiness, it's not a good way to think about it. In fact, they're very good for your well-being to have these cathartic experiences of releasing emotion through kind of darker themes in art. And so I think that it's really challenging to find a good construct, valid measure of well-being that can be sensitive to the fact that there's such aesthetic diversity and pluralism about what makes people well off in the case of art. Secondly, there's problems of cultural relativity. Oh my gosh, the more anthropology you read, the more you see how sophisticated humans can be in different contexts. And you see that what makes them well off in one society is completely different in another society. Thirdly, there's open questions about the reduction of well-being to neuroscience. I personally am extremely skeptical that such a project is coherent at all, but that's not to say that neuroscience can't contribute to the science of well-being. It is to say that well-being surely cannot be reduced entirely to neuroscience, but there remains a raging debate about this. And the last, I think, most serious problem for well-being studies is how can we overcome the problem of a lack of intersubjective verifiability of mental states? I can't look at your mental states. I can't hear them, can't taste them, I can't touch them. They are completely intangible. They're not even identical to your brain. Your brain generates your conscious experience, but that's not to confuse what your conscious experience is for the brain. They're different things, even if one fully causes the other. So it's really unclear how it is that we can intersubjectively verify mental states and happiness. So that poses a general scientific problem for measures of happiness. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you did, feel free to make a comment below. You can also email me in the description box below. If you like this lecture and you want to see more, check out the other lectures and discussions that I'm having on this YouTube channel in the playlist entitled HPS 300 Philosophy of Social Science. Hope you got something out of it and have a great rest of the day.